So my name is Craig Fowler, and this is the Scatman Story. It all started on the Appalachian Trail in 2001. I was about 8 days into my hike, hadn't showered in that time. My legs were chafed from wearing my rain pants for quite some time, as it was quite wet. And I remember when I was in the first hostel, the blueberry patch, my butt was, let's put it this way, was a bit irritated from the lack of proper cleaning. Well, the next day I got a ride to the trailhead, and I passed a bunch of guys in the parking lot, looked like some weekend hikers, and I was thinking, oh, we won't see those guys again. I ended up stopping to take off a rain jacket, and they passed me, and I was like, oh, I won't see them again. Sure enough, I stopped for something else, and they passed me, and I once again passed them, thinking, once more, I will never see these guys again because I'm a thru hiker after all. I'm going to Maine. Later on up the trail, I caught this gentleman. He did not know I was there, had no clue I was behind him, and I did my best to let him know. Finally, I cleared my throat, scared the shit out of the guy. Turns around, he's got this mustache, he's got these dark wireframe Ray-Bans, and his name's Mr. Pat is his trail name. He gives me a bite-sized Snickers, and I look at it, and I'm thinking, I wouldn't trust this guy with my daughter. I'd slam the door in his face. I'm thinking, what did he do to this candy? So I took it, I stuck it in my feed bag, and I kept on walking. Later that night, I get to Muskrat Creek Shelter, and Mr. Pat shows up. Turns out to be a great guy, friends after all. And then Skipper and Steve, two of the 5 guys that I had passed earlier, show up. Turns out Skipper and Steve are practical jokers, and they go on these hikes every year. Their buddies had stuffed 5 bricks into one backpack and a 15-pound dumbbell into the other one. Now, mind you, these guys both had 2-man tents each, can of lanterns, their own stove. They shared nothing. Complete, just off-the-wall crazy guys. They ended up camping. But throughout the night, they had their maps out, and they were like 2 Civil War generals planning their days of attack. Had bourbon. It was amazing. Next morning, after Mr. Pat and I had spent the night in the shelter, on the way to the poo shed, Mr. Pat's on his way up there, and Skipper's just like, where'd that come from? I shit in the woods last night. And we're like, it was there the whole time. He touched saying something about bringing back some red-eye sausage from the shelter, from the poo shed. Mr. Pat has no clue what he's talking about. None of us do. But he's like, hey, do you want eggs and bacon with that as well? So Mr. Pat comes back from the bathroom, and there's a few more jokes here and there, and I take off. And first one out of the shelter, I make my way all the way to the next shelter, and Mr. Pat catches me after a little bit as I'm hanging out. And he's like, hey, let's go down a little bit further to this, Betty Creek Gap. So we hike 4 more miles. We get down there, we get water, and I'm done with my water, and I'm trying to find a place to camp. I hear this whistling, this singing, and all of a sudden I realize it's Skipper and Steve. They've done a 16-mile day on their second day out, and I'm just like, wow. So the 4 of us end up spending the night in this rhododendron thicket right there in Betty Creek Gap. And as we're hanging out, all of a sudden Skipper looks at me and he says, so there, Craig, Mr. Pat tells me you have a problem with your scat hole. And I was like, he says it's very irritated. I turned to Mr. Pat and I'm like, thanks, Mr. Pat. Because Mr. Pat and I, like hikers do, we discussed our ailments, and I had told him that my ass was irritated. So this is where the floodgates open. And he asked me, Skipper looks at me dead serious, goes, what are you going to do with your scat hole, Scatman? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, well, do you got anything you can put on it? And I was like, I thought about it for a second, and I was like, oh, I've got some Gold Bond powder in my bag for my feet. Maybe I'll put that on there. And he sits there and looks at me deadpan and goes, you're going to put some Gold Bond powder on your scat hole? And he just says it in this southern twang, Gold Bond powder. And we're all dying laughing. And I'm like, yeah, why not? I have nothing to lose. So he's like, when are you going to put it on? I was like, maybe when I change my pants, So I get into my shelter. I barely even got the zipper on the door shut. And he's like, are you looking at your scat hole right now, Scatman? And I'm just like, oh, man, are you kidding me? And I had made the mistake of telling him I had a mirror for my contacts and I was going to look at it. All of a sudden, he's like, hey, do you want that water bottle with that duct tape? And I'm thinking, duct tape? What the hell am I need duct tape for? He's like, yeah. He's like, so you can tape those privates up out of the way so you can see your scat hole better. And I just like lose it. And I'm like, just the vision of duct tape on my ball sack. Not what I want to do. So I tell him, you know what, Skipper? I think I can handle it. I have 2 hands and a headlamp. So sure enough, I get in there with my headlamp and I tell him, like, oh, it doesn't look good, Skipper. It's all red and irritated. And by this, I just put straight fuel in the fire at this point. So I powder up, I get out there, and we're hanging out. We're out on the fire. We've all cooked, so we've had a good time. And all of a sudden, the Skipper's like, he's like, if that Gold Bond powder doesn't work, he's like, I bet you Mr. Steve's got some ointment in that big old first aid kit of his. And Steve's like, that's it, I'm out. He throws his hands up. He's like, all right, Mr. Pat, you're up. And he's like, Mr. Pat's going to take that ointment. He's going to put it on that log there. He's like, you're going to tape them privates up with that duct tape. It doesn't get any easier every time he says it. He's like, then you're just going to slide on down that log and apply it to your scat hole. And I'm sitting on this log. I get up, I look at it, and I'm like, it's probably 3 feet in diameter. And I look at him, I go, I don't know about you, Skipper, but I don't think I can spray my cheeks that far. He's like, yeah, you're right. He's like, that is a big log. He's like, here's what we're going to do. Mr. Pat's going to put on those surgical gloves that Steve has in his bag. He's going to grab one of those sticks. You're going to tape up them privates with that duct tape, and you're just going to lean over. He's just going to dab a little bit in your scat hole. And I'm just like, oh my God. It would be sick if anyone else was listening. And he's joking about having 2 teenage daughters, and it's wrong for him. We go to bed, wake up the next morning, and all of a sudden I hear, Shazam, it's cold. And I'm like, who says Shazam? He's like, Gomer Pyle, didn't you ever watch that? And I'm like, I'm older than most hikers, but no, I never watched that. And he's like, mid-sentence, he stops, he goes, oh, how's that scat hole doing, Scatman? And we're all just like, oh my God, did he think about this all night? And I tell him it's doing better. I leave camp, first one again, won't see these guys. Sure enough, they catch me. Catch me at Albert Mountain. Albert Mountain's like the first place you go hand over fist kind of climbing. And he gets there, and I think it's it's Skipper, sorry. And I was like, well, I think Skipper is Mr. Pat. And I go, is that you, Mr. Pat? He's like, no, it's Skipper. He's been teaching me to talk Southern. Everything's I reckon and uh-huh. So I'm like, is that you? He's like, yeah, it's me. He's like, you coming up? He's like, uh-huh, I reckon I am. I was like, you going to be up there? I'm like, uh-huh. He comes up, and he's like, sweating profusely, just dying. He's like, I reckon I made it. Next, Steve comes. We think it's Mr. Pat, and we finally all join up, except for Mr. Pat. He doesn't show up. As we're sitting there, Skipper turns to me and looks at me and goes, Craig? He's like, sorry, Scatman. He's like, I was thinking last night. And we're just like, oh, God, he was. We're like, Jesus. And he goes, if that gold bomb powder has to reapply, here's what we're going to do. He's like, do you know how Boy Scouts barebag their food with 2 trees instead of 1? I'm like, yeah. He's like, what we're going to do, we're going to cut that 50-foot bear bag rope of yours in half. We're going to tie 1 piece on each ankle. He's like, you've got to tape them privates up with that duct tape. Mr. Pat's going to put on those surgical gloves. Mr. Steve and I are going to pull you up in a big old wide. And he throws his hands up. He's like, Mr. Pat's going to walk over and just sprinkle a little bit of gold bomb powder in your scat hole. And Steve and I are just beside ourselves. So we're just dying. So we hike on, and we get to their rally point a day early. So I leave them there, and he told me before I left, he's like, he'd think of a trail name for me. He's like, you went to Green Mountain College, you like the Green Mountains, your trail name should be Green Mountain. So I walk away another 4 miles thinking I'm going to be Green Mountain for the next 2,000 miles. And I meet this young man named Seamus at a waterhole, and he goes, let's go up to Siler's Ball, we'll camp there. Mr. Pat joins us, and I tell him this story, the Scatman story, for the first time. As we're sitting there, I tell him the story. Seamus looks at me, he goes, Craig, he goes, have you ever heard the Scatman song? I was like, no. I'm like, who does it? He's like, I think it's the guys that do the Macarena. I think it's the B-side. I was like, well, how does it go? And he's just like, he thinks, he's like, bee-ba-da-ba-da-bop, ba-da-ba-da-bop. I'm like, a little bit more, buddy. I need some more. And he's like, ba-da-ba-bop, I'm the Scatman. I'm like, is that it? And he's like, yeah, that's pretty much it. I was like, yeah, I never heard it. He's like, yeah. He's like, I think, he's like, no offense, Craig. He's like, I barely know you. I just met you. He's like, but I don't want to disrespect you, but Green Mountain? He's like, that's a lame trail name. He's like, I think you should be the Scatman. And I'm just like, wait, so you want me to walk around for the next 4 months saying, hi, my name is the shit man? Because that's what people are going to think. I don't look like a musician. He's like, yeah, it's a funny story. You can tell that story. So I look at Mr. Pat, and Mr. Pat's laughing his ass off. He's like, it is a funny story. So sure enough, I go on reluctantly for the next few weeks thinking I'm a Scatman. And to seal the deal, I'm at Damascus, Virginia, one of the biggest trail towns in the Appalachian Trail, and we're at a King Dairy, formerly a Dairy Queen, if you hadn't guessed. And Mr. Pat's like, hey, give me your change, I'm like, what? And he's like, just give me your money. So I give him the money, and next thing I know, I hear the Scatman song on the radio from the jukebox, and we proceed to eat our ice cream listening to the Scatman song. I would proceed in the next 4 months to tell the Scatman song probably dozens of times, once to an audience of 35 people in a mountain, on Sugarloaf Mountain in Maine. And that's the first thing people would do. They'd come to me and say, hey, you're the Scatman? Tell me the Scatman story. So, and there you have it. That is the Scatman story. Hear from the Scatman himself. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.